Hi everyone and welcome. I'm down here in my wormery and I've got a couple of my oldest bins here. This is my second oldest bin, which I actually harvested a couple weeks ago. And basically the harvested castings are right in this side of the bin. All the worms had already been removed and moved into other new bins, and this is actually my oldest bin right here. Today it's 154 days of age. It's the equivalent of 22 weeks at this point. And I did check in here a couple nights ago to look around throughout the finished castings to see if there's still a lot of worms in there remaining to, make their way over into the feeding zone. The feeding zone is over on that other side, covered in plastic. To the best of my ability, I picked out a couple that I found here and there, and I certainly didn't see many. And that was three nights ago, I believe. So I would assume between me actually helping a number of the few stragglers over into the feeding zone, as well as those remaining 3 days that I've given them to really complete their migration, I do have a pretty good hunch that today, on day 154, at 22 weeks of age, I can call this bin as complete. So the worms are coming out, and I've actually arranged a trade with a fellow who's got a worm farm starting off, and he was interested in my worms, so he's going to send me some of his worms in exchange. So the worms that are in this bin are actually going to a new home. So we won't be releasing them today. We're just going to be scooping them out, and then I'll take care of packaging them up and sending them later. But we are going to, take care of getting the castings separated from the worms. And that makes this bin kind of fall right on par with what my average is. I've got a tracking spreadsheet that attempts to keep track of the age of all of my bins that I've ever had, dozens of bins over a few years, and my average age is 153 days of age. So at 154 days of age, this bin pretty much hits the mark on getting completed in the average amount of time that it normally takes in my wormery. So I'm going to get a glove on, and we're going to get that bin out on the bench, so let's get to work. Okay, so here's the bin. So I've got my little handy-dandy plastic container that I usually use to put my worms into temporarily when I'm in the process of relocating them from one place to another. So let's see if we could shake off some of these castings. Make sure we don't have any worms stuck to anything here. Alright, so I'm guessing that none of this stuff is really going to be needed. This stuff can all be, I guess, recycled in some way elsewhere. The material, you can see, has got a pretty nice dry consistency to it. I didn't really film a couple occasions when I came down here to agitate this material, try to bring moist stuff up to the surface, sink the more dry stuff down, give it a chance to all get exposure to the air to help it evaporate and dry off a little bit. I'm going to take one of these coffee filters. Got a new type of coffee machine now, so it's going to be different types of coffee filters I'm using from now on. Although I do have a pretty good, huge collection of the old type of coffee filters still from the old coffee machine. I do have a lot of material in here that I don't intend to send to the recipient of these worms. I'm trying to think how to most easily separate this stuff, and it's making me wonder if I'd be better off in a larger container where I can actually do some work after the fact to get this stuff separated a little bit better. So yeah, why don't I grab a different container? So use a somewhat larger piece of paper over here that we can protect the bottom of the container with so it doesn't get all filthy. Then we can begin scooping out the contents of this feeding area. Maybe right off the bat I can try to take some of the stuff that's right here on the surface, which doesn't really seem to have any worms in it, and keep that somewhat separate from the rest of the material, which I'm assuming is going to be pretty densely populated with worms. Here and there I'm spotting a couple worms already, so I'm not certain I've managed to avoid all of them. I can see a couple here and there. Drop them back in. I guess this stuff can probably just go into another of my active bins so it can continue breaking down. If I do spot a worm over here, though, I figured what the heck, I'll probably just try to return them to the rest of the group. Try to maximize the number of worms I end up pulling out of here. Got a feeling at this point we're getting close enough to where the more dense population of worms in this container are located. A little bit lower than what we're seeing here, but not much lower, I'm sure. But luckily we did manage to pull out a good number of handfuls of material, which is definitely not worms. Just looks like it's a lot of castings. It seems like the worms have been dumping their castings in here near the surface, but then diving back down to get at the food that's in here. Or maybe just it's more damp and cozy for them down lower. Not sure exactly why. I hope that this is not indicative of the number of worms that are going to be down lower too, because what's up top here definitely does not have a lot of worms in it. But I got a feeling down low is where we're going to probably find a good number of worms. At least that's what I'm hoping. It's kind of funny because we didn't even really inspect the finished castings before proceeding to this step. I wonder if it might make good sense before we do this to take a quick look within the finished castings just to verify that we have in fact completed this migration before we disassemble the whole setup. So why don't we just do that really quick before we proceed. The spot where we would probably expect to find worms remaining is over here where the moisture has been recirculating because of the plastic bag that had been covering things up here. And I'm seeing a lot of really nice castings, but so far no worms to speak of. There's one here. If I do spot one, I guess I'll just send them over to the edge where we want them. Here's another one. I think the last time we did a migration like this, we had pretty much found not a single worm within the material. There we go, I just found a third one. This material might, might still be a little bit more damp than the material in the other bin was when I wrapped things up, meaning that the worms are going to feel pretty comfortable staying in it for a longer period of time until it dries out better. And there's also a good amount of debris in here, little bits of leaf stems and stuff like that, so there's also a pretty fair bit of remaining food for them to continue eating in this stuff too. But I think we're doing pretty good here. I've pulled a couple worms out, but not too many. I just want to kind of come up with a good point at some point over here that I can draw the line. Obviously I had this separator here which was attempting to draw that line. And it's full of holes, so it wasn't meant to be a barrier to prevent the worms from crossing it to get over at the food and the moisture. It was really just for me to be able to better see where the finished castings were and separate it to some degree from the feeding area that I had set up to try to bait the worms out of it. So I pretty much scraped the very edge of this piece of cardboard here, and I believe we've fished out almost all the worms. That's what, five, six worms we pulled out altogether, but other than them, it does seem like we've successfully depopulated this whole batch of castings over here. I'm trying to remember now how much time has elapsed since we started this horizontal migration process. I think it was maybe a dozen days or so, something along those lines, that we did that first extraction of worms out of here, and then we might have left it go for another dozen days, I forget. So I've got a feeling we're somewhere in the neighborhood of about 24 days, maybe a few more days, or maybe we were shooting for 24 days to match the time it took to depopulate the other bin's material. but this bin might have just needed a little bit more time to get finished. So maybe we're actually at 28 days. I can't remember exactly. But that's not bad. It took less than a month, if you think about it that way, to get the to get all the worms to make their way over from the finished castings over into this feeding area, so that we can extract them and have access to their castings, which I will probably take right outside and dump it into my garden. I spent some time out in the garden the other day, for a few days actually, trying to pick up all the leaves that were covering up all the garden and the walkways and the yard. So now my garden is actually free of leaves, and I was actually thinking of taking some of my castings and dumping them out into the garden, mainly because I'm kind of running out of space to store them. I've got so much material, so much castings material, that I figured might as well put it to good use and put it out in the garden, even though we're coming up on winter at this point. So let's see, what are we going to do now? I've got this smaller container that I think I can actually, am I going to fit these in there if I try to do that? No, because I still want the space so that I can work on separating the worms from the material. So I'm going to actually move over all this stuff that appears to be more or less worm-free, so that we can actually regain use of this larger container. And now we're going to actually place the worms into here. And yeah, how can I do this? Again, I wanted to try to keep this thing from getting all dirty. Let's bring this piece of paper back so we can rest the plastic container on here, and then we'll just start scooping. I think we already had a little bit of a sneak preview, and we saw that there's a good number of worms in this material. The fellow that I'm doing this worm swap with, we agreed on 2 pounds of worms from my wormery in exchange for 2 pounds of worms from his wormery. And I believe, if my memory serves me correctly, I believe he had mentioned something about the fact that his red wigglers were obtained from Uncle Jim's Worm Farm, which is a pretty well-known worm retailer. I think they work out of Pennsylvania, maybe. But one thing I've always heard about those Uncle Jim's worms is that you order red wigglers, but you really end up with sort of a combination of red wigglers plus, I think some people say that you get a lot of blue worms when you get Uncle Jim's red wigglers. So you're not only getting red wigglers, but it's combined with blue worms as well, which, as far as I know, I do not have in my population. Just based on that, since I can't even confirm it or deny it for sure, but just based on that, I might do a little bit of research on this. But just based on the assumption that what I'm getting from this other guy is, in fact, a combination of red wigglers and something else, I believe I am going to keep the population of worms that I receive from him in isolation, separate from the rest of my red wigglers, assuming that it is, in fact, not a pure population of red wigglers only, that it is kind of a mix. So I'll be setting up a fresh bin to place those worms into once I receive them. I've not yet set that bin up, so I'm gonna have to take care of that. I'll probably do that a little bit later today, because it's going to be about another maybe week or so that those worms arrive here. But by then I want their habitat to be kind of nice and pre-prepared, already having been sitting around for a little while, and kind of primed, if you will. I want the material in the bin that they're going to be placed into to have an opportunity to sort of get, first of all, inoculated with some microbes and bacteria and fungi and stuff. So I'll place a little bit of finished castings material into the bin, the freshly built bin. Wow, this thing is heavy. And then after a week's time or so, whatever food it is that I've placed into that container will most likely already be starting into the breakdown process. So by the time the worms get introduced, it'll be you know, chock full of material that the worms can hopefully start to just rip right into and start eating and whatnot. So we've got ourselves a pretty good number of worms here. I might actually end up weighing this so that you know, I sent him the promised 2 pounds, but if I've got more in here, I'll, you know, just introduce them into my newest red wiggler bin. And maybe we will actually have a little bit of a worm release here. But I might have to go through sort of a little bit of a light separation. And by that I mean allowing the worms a little bit of time to dive down into the material that they occupy, which they will do based on the fact that they see all this bright light coming at them from overhead. And they'll want to kind of get out of the light. So they'll burrow themselves down into the material beneath them. And once they do, I can start skimming off bits and pieces of this material on the top, which will enable me at some point eventually work my way down to almost just a pile of worms only at the bottom, removing a lot of material off the top that's not worms. So I'm going to give these guys a little bit of time to dive down, and then I'll come back in here and I'll start skimming stuff off, and I'll have this container here that I can place stuff into, which I've confirmed to be mostly not worms. But if I bring a few worms over, it doesn't matter either. This stuff too will just be placed into one of my active worm bins, and I'll just treat it as extra bedding, extra food to give to those worms. Maybe I'll even consider it as a feeding, because there's stuff like, you know, uneaten banana stems here, a whole bunch of bedding type stuff, uneaten chunks of food. So there is a bunch of stuff in here that I'm going to be able to consider almost as an entire feeding once I collect it all. So if you look at it, there's a pretty good amount of stuff in here, a lot of which is probably food. Alright, so I'm going to go take a break here, let these worms start to dive down. I'll come in here and I'll begin separating these little guys from their compost and the stuff that they're occupying. Well, I've been at this for about 10 minutes now, and I've been just skimming material off the top. Every now and then I hit a jumble of kind of strips of newspaper, and they're a little bit, you know, kind of like in little balls almost, and there's almost always like a bunch of worms tucked in there. So I'm trying to kind of unfold, you know, these little bundles of newspaper to make sure I'm not bringing a whole bunch of worms along for the ride each time I pull out a bunch of that. So I'm kind of taking my time. I'm not in a real hurry here to get this taken care of. Just kind of having fun with the worms here. I don't want to put them under a great deal of stress with all the fiddling around either. But once in a while I do kind of do a larger skim off the top here just to see, you know, what I can see. And you can see there's a lot of worms hanging out right down there, a little bit lower. So I believe what we're trying to accomplish here is kind of working. Every now and then I'll just try to fluff this stuff up a little bit too to, you know, better expose it to the light, hopefully causing the worms to want to just leave the material and dive down into the pile. So, I'm in no hurry, like I said, so I'll keep plugging away at this here. Just figured I'd check in since I've already got about another 10 minutes worth of progress here under my belt. But we'll check in again in a few minutes after I've made more progress. Let's see how things are coming along. Come on, worms. Get off. Alright, so I've slid the pile over to that side so I can, I thought I saw some stuff over here, and I saw a couple tomato chunks. I can see just by moving it aside I've got access to a few larger piles of paper here. But as soon as we did that too, we can already catch another sneak preview of what's happening down low. which is a pretty good sized worm ball starting to assemble. It does seem like when you start doing this, the stuff on the top just becomes really easy to peel off because they're all just down low. I still feel like there's still a lot of junk commingled with the worms. Like right here, I just kind of combed through the material, and here's another chunk of tomato, a pretty good sized chunk of tomato. Not surprising that they're enjoying it because it's just, you know, almost entirely water content. So they're probably enjoying that. I always heard stories about, you know, stuff like peppers and tomatoes, which are part of a family of vegetables. I believe they're called nightshades. And nightshades, I thought, were something that worms generally don't like for whatever reason. So I've, you know, very often avoided trying to give them peppers and tomatoes. But I figured I had a whole bunch of tomatoes that were just rotting away, and I thought that the worms might like it. And it does seem like they do. So just maybe another one of those vermicomposting myths of what to give your worms, what not to give your worms. I'm almost at the point where I've just, you know, given up on all those little things and treating them all as myths and rumors, and I'm almost ready to give my worms anything at this point, because I got a feeling they'll pretty much do away with just about anything. So it does seem like I stirred a lot of stuff up to the surface, including worms, so I should probably give them a little more time to dive down so I can more easily scoop stuff off the top here. But maybe I could do another roll over here of the material. Let's see how things are progressing. Maybe I could take a lot of this stuff that appears to be not worms and try to separate it from what appears to be mostly worms. I don't know. Trying different things. But I am finding large chunks of paper that I want to see if I can extract out of here. I'm trying to boil this down to where I'm sending pretty much worms only. Although I might actually reuse some of this stuff. I bet if I send the worms with some of this material, they'd be really cozy in it, in transit. But I'd like to do a good separation of the worms from the material that they're inhabiting right now, just so I can at least get them on the scale. And just make sure I'm, you know, providing what was agreed to in terms of overall weight of worms. I'm pretty sure I should be able to come up with two pounds of worms in here pretty easily. At least I hope so. Sure looks that way. Ooh, okay, well, we'll check back in soon. I'll just continue on this as I've been doing for the past 15-20 minutes now. You can see I'm getting pretty close to being full on this container. We've also got a nice pile of worms developing over here. Alright, we'll check back in a few minutes. Alright, so now I think just to give myself a little bit more space here, I'm going to pull this pile of worms out. And I think in my estimation that even if there is some other material mixed in with them, the majority of the weight that I'm getting when I weigh this is going to be mainly worms. At least 95% worms. So a little bit of castings material or whatever it is that's still mixed in with them is going to be a negligible amount of weight as far as I'm concerned. So I figured we would place these little guys up onto the scale at this point to see how we're coming along. And here I've also given myself a little bit more space to continue working my way through this other pile that I made. See that the top is pretty much depopulated. So I'm assuming down low is where the majority of the worms are at this point. So I'm thinking hopefully we'll get a good number of worms out of there as well. But I'm going to position my little scale over here so we can see what we came up with. I believe it's zeroed. The plastic container that the worms are in right now is 1.5 ounces in weight. So that's 1 pound of worms right there if you deduct the 1.5 ounces. of the overall weight, which accounts for the container. So it looks like I'm halfway there. I thought I'd have more, but I guess we'll have to see how many more we can pull out of that pile that still remains in there. But I think in order to reach the 2 pounds, I may have to dip into one of my other systems to get some more worms. Alright, so I'll continue skimming here and see what else I can come up with in terms of additional worms out of this pile. But I might have to empty this container soon too. It's really running out of space. And I think for the most part it's not worms, it's just bedding and castings and food items that didn't get consumed. I would have to assume that the majority of what's over here is probably not worms. But you can see that this stuff is really muddy, really gooey. That's exactly what I was going for, because I knew that that's what would attract the worms out of the finished compost. But when it comes to trying to separate them from the material, that's where it starts to get a little bit tricky. And I should probably just not go too crazy trying to pick all the worms out. If I've got like maybe a little bit of a worm pile hanging out at the bottom of the pile, I should just see if I can come up with a little bit more out of here. And then I believe I should be able to more easily fetch some worms out of one of my other systems to hit the 2 pounds I'm trying to reach. So I'm going to keep skimming here and we'll check back in a few minutes. Alright, so I took a moment to go to my newest red wiggler worm bin to uncover the container so I can get a good look at what I've got going on over there. And it did seem to me like if I were to just pull the feeding zone of that container up, or a good portion of it up, I should have no problem collecting a good large number of worms out of there. But I'll also have to do a certain degree of separation of the worms from the material that they inhabit. So I would like to try to get a somewhat accurate weight on what I've collected here. And, you know, at some point I'll, when I package these little guys up for delivery, I will place them into a material that they could be comfortable in while they're traveling. But for the measurement of how many I've collected, I do want to try to exclude as much of this non-worm material as possible. So I figured I would just take what remains of this pile over here, try to skim out what I can quickly. And, you know, this stuff doesn't have a lot of weight to it. So if a little bit of it goes along for the ride with the worms, that's fine. But I wanted to just see if I can fetch the last of the few worms that were inhabiting this pile, or at least the ones that had gotten together into a reasonable little worm ball. So I could just move them all together over into the collection of worms that we've got so far. Once they dive down, I could skim some of that material off pretty easily as well. And then we're going to free up this container so that we can do an extraction of worms from my newest red wiggler worm bin, where I believe there is quite a good number of worms in there. Probably close to 3 pounds of worms in there, and if I only need maybe another, I don't know, maybe 3/4 of a pound to get this job done, I don't think I'll be biting into the population of that worm bin too much. And then as long as we got that container out on the bench, we can go ahead and we could place all this material right back in there. Give ourselves a little bit more room in this container so we can sort of repeat the process with another batch of worms from another bin. Then we'll have the working container emptied. Then we'll have the container that we're putting all the skimmed material into empty, and we can start again. So let's make some space over here. Put this aside briefly. This as well. And let's get the other bin over here onto the bench. Okay, so the same as we did in the other bin, we're just going to scoop. We're going to scoop some worms out. We'll We'll grab a piece of newspaper to protect the bottom of the plastic container so it doesn't get all filthy. We'll move some stuff aside here. The last feeding was applied right down the middle, so that's where I'm going to expect a good number of worms to be hanging out. And when we do the scooping out, we're going to also bring with it a whole bunch of food and other junk as well. So we'll have to do a little bit of skimming and separating there too. But I'm assuming we should be able to do that pretty efficiently, or at least I hope so. So let's see how we can fare if we just start scooping out of here and what we get. Ooh. There's lots of worms in here. Shouldn't take too long for us to collect. Maybe 3/4 pound to get us up to 2 pounds in that small clear container. Trying not to make a huge mess here either. I think we've got enough here. Maybe we'll just do one more handful to make it easy to do the separation. I guess the more worms we have here, the easier it'll be to do the separation. So I think with this many worms and mixed up material, we should be able to pull this off pretty quickly. I don't want to make a federal project out of this. I don't want to spend all day making this happen. But to make some room in here, we're just going to go ahead and restore the space that we created with a whole bunch of bedding type material and food, and a good number of worms probably came along for the ride as well. So I'm going to try to level things off here a little bit. This cardboard was really just trying to indicate to us where we had last fed. So just thinking this bin really did have lots and lots of worms in it, so I didn't worry too much about, you know, using this as a source. And I knew that if I didn't come up with enough worms out of my harvested batch, then I can definitely lean into this a little bit to obtain some more worms to reach the goal. So we're almost leveled off here. I'm thinking I didn't see a whole lot of food in here as I pulled stuff out. It was basically worms only almost. Some castings, but not a lot of food. So let's put this back up on the shelf. All right, so let's get things back the way they were over here, so we can resume what we started, but now with a new pile that needs some separating. And I'm going to assume that this pile might even have more worms in it than the other one did. So I'm wondering if it might just be easier to, I got a feeling it's going to be, you know, a lot easier to accomplish it here. So I'm not going to be as picky. I'm going to just keep skimming as quickly as I can. I think maybe, oh, here's our pumpkin stem. That's just an item that we've been tracking from bin to bin to bin. So I'm not being as picky here, I believe. I'm just gonna maybe overturn this pile once or twice. Make sure I get these large handfuls of bedding type materials that I can sense. And I think you could tell already that there's gonna be a huge worm ball right smack in the middle of this pretty quickly without me needing to go too crazy separating here. That's kind of what I was hoping for too. Alrighty. So I'll do a few skims over here. I'll turn the pile a couple times. I'm going to do my best to try to end up with just a kind of a pile of worms underneath here with as little bit of this sort of stuff mixed in with it as possible. And I think we should be able to scoop over enough to reach 2 pounds on that collection of worms that I need to send out. So I think we're going to be pretty close to being done here in a few minutes. I'm obviously not a professional worm retailer. Because if I were, then I'd be losing money here. I'd be wasting so much time. If I was selling worms, I would need to be able to pull off the extraction of a couple pounds of worms pretty quickly and easily without having to fiddle around as much as this. But whatever. It's all for fun, right? Let's give this pile a little bit of time for the worms to dive, and I should be able to do another skim or two. And I think we should be able to pull some more worms out of here pretty readily. Damn, look at that. This is just another tomato, but this one is like totally mobbed with worms. They've like totally like crawled into the inside of the tomato to try to get at the insides of it. So I got a feeling that worms definitely like tomatoes. Whatever, I don't have to go crazy separating everything here. I think I'm going to do just fine with what I got. Let's give these little guys a moment or two to get out of the light. I could do another skim or two, and then I think we should be able to get our 2 pounds of worms pretty soon. Alright. As I observe the worms here trying to take shelter from the lights overhead, it does seem like there's very little, if any, material for them to burrow into anymore. They burrow down into the pile of worms beneath them. They leave behind little bits and pieces of material that's, you know, maybe some bedding, maybe some food, maybe some castings. But for the most part, I believe that what's remaining here in this pile is worms. Probably a little bit of other stuff still mixed in here too, but once again, like before, I would think it's negligible as far as weight is concerned. And it almost looks to me like we've got more here now than we had in the other one. The worms that came together as a result of that horizontal migration. So I think all we need out of here is maybe a couple handfuls of worms. And this should get us up to the 2 pounds that I'm after. Just going to do another little kind of roll over here to see what other kinds of piles of non-worm material comes together here. But as you can see, when I roll the pile over, pretty much worms only, right? Just a couple chunks of maybe uneaten food or whatever it is that this stuff is. But everything else appears to be worms. I keep worrying about some worms kind of ending up over in this dry area without anything to keep them moist and comfortable. I wouldn't want any worms just kind of drying out here within this container because I neglected them. But you know what? I think we're at the point where we can probably, yeah, let's get the scale back out here so we can try to bring our collection of worms up to 2 pounds, and then we'll be finished. So just as we saw earlier, so far we've got ourselves a pound here. The 1.5 pounds is the container itself. So let's see what it takes to get us up to 2 pounds. It's 1 pound 9 ounces. Whoa. Let's just bring this whole stack over. What do we got? Alright, so now we're pretty much at 2¼ pounds. So it does seem like we've got ourselves maybe a 1/4 pound of extra worms here. I'm just going to try to, you know what? Why don't I put this stuff in here. And I could just fish out any stragglers in here. I don't want to have any worms drying and dying here in this plastic container. So I want to make sure they're all someplace safe and comfortable. And speaking of somewhere safe and comfortable, in terms of how I'm going to transport these little guys, I don't know, I've been maybe just using an old, been using like an old t-shirt or something like that, like an old tank t-shirt or something, like an undershirt, which is clean. It's right out of the drawer, you know, so it's not like I'm taking something out of the hamper. But I'm just taking like an old t-shirt and kind of tying off the bottom of it, making it into a little bit of a bag, sort of. Or maybe just cutting the top off of it so that maybe the two straps that go over your shoulders have been removed, and there's just the torso piece of the t-shirt. And then I'll kind of tie the bottom of it together, and that'll turn it into a little bit of a bag, sort of. And then I could drop in the worms, but I don't want to put the worms in with nothing. I'm gonna take some damp leaves and whatever, some material that I kind of commingle them with. I'm even thinking maybe I should just use some of this material right here, because this is nice and damp. It's got a good amount of food in it. It's even got some worms in it as well. It's actually quite a number of worms in it. Yeah, you know what? What I can do is maybe take a handful of worms out of here, because we're well over the 2 pounds in here, at least by a couple ounces. And then all the worms that are in this material already will bring us back up to the 2 pounds. As you can see, there's quite a number of worms hanging out in this material. But this material has got bedding, it's got moisture, it's got food scraps, and this will sustain them, you know, for the trip. And it's not a long trip. They should be there in a day or two. But at least they'll be damp. They'll have bedding and food. And that should get them to their destination pretty comfortably. All right, you know what? I think that's it. There's not much more to do here. We came down here with the intention of finalizing this 154-day-old worm bin to get this horizontal migration zone depopulated, leaving us with only finished castings over here. And you know, I've got worms that I can complete my transaction with. So I'll take care of the rest of this offline. I've got a box from the post office. I'll have to fabricate a bag out of a t-shirt and get this package going so that they can get at their destination as quickly as possible, so they could be moved into their new home as quickly as possible. But like I said, I'm going to do all of that offline at this point. So before I go, let me just really quickly say thank you. Thanks so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed the video. If you did, remember, give me a quick thumbs up. Showing that you like the video helps a lot, and I really appreciate it. And also consider subscribing to the channel as well. That's really appreciated too. All right, everyone, have a great day. Thanks so much for watching. Bye-bye. Yeah.